chair of the session, but I thought I would share a couple of administrative notes. One is that this session is interpreted, so there is an option for Spanish. If you look towards the bottom of your screen, interpretation, and you can choose Spanish if you would prefer that. And another note is that every day, so Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 6 p.m., and that's Santiago Valparaiso time, there is a happy hour session. Everyone is invited. It's on Zoom. It does not require any registration, and it's an open space for dialogue where we really hope to continue these wonderful conversations, where more voices will be heard and interesting conversations will take place. So those are two fun things to keep in mind. And with that, I will say thank you so much to Petar Jandrić for being with us today, despite the madness of this season and all sorts of fun surprises. I'm thrilled to see your face and to be able to collaborate with you and your colleagues once again. And I'll hand it over to you, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Miranda. Welcome everybody to this session on post-digital ecopedagogies. I would first like, of course, to thank the organizers, Miranda, also Paul Carr, and everybody else from the UNESCO-DCMÉT chair who really organized this amazing conference. Last year, I was much more present in this conference than this year because unfortunately, there's an overlap with another conference where I'm chairing the program. But then there's a bright side to it because at the last moment, we actually made some changes in our setup. So instead of some of the original speakers, we have some other speakers here that I would like to quickly introduce. So and then I will like say briefly what the session is roughly about. So few years ago, so let's start with the introduction. From the UK, we have Sarah Hayes. Sarah is actually the only member, together with myself, of the original crew for this session. We did a lot of post-digital work together over the years. Sarah is an associate editor of Postdigital Science and Education, and we wrote together so much that actually I often really can't even remember who wrote which paper and who is the first or second or last author or whatever. Then we have Jeremy Knox, similarly, also an associate editor for Postdigital Science and Education, critical educator, and the very close friends. We also did a lot of work together. And we have Michael Gallagher, who is also somebody we all work together. I mean, now I'm repeating myself, but I really mean that we've done so many projects together over the years that it's just very hard to pinpoint a specific one. Now, today we are talking about, I'll just share my screen very quickly. So today, our theme for today are post-digital ecopedagogies. This is the book that, well, at the time when they proposed the session, there was no book. So the idea was to kind of explore the intersections between post-digital perspectives and post-digital understanding of the world and critical pedagogy, or more specifically, ecopedagogies. So the idea really was to intersect the post-digital thinking with ecopedagogical thinking, not just with the ways of how we can really teach about the environment and tell people about the environment, but also how we can develop critical consciousness, how we can act individually and especially collectively in order to make, well, the world a better place. And there is and interestingly enough, as I will say later, I mean, the book has like 15 chapters. So there's the educational intellectual coordinates, and then there's global anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, decolonial struggles. It's a very important part. And then there's the aesthetics of pedagogies. Now, I'm not going to talk about the book really, because I don't think that it's that we need to talk about the book. But what I would like to say is that this work has started as a conversation really amongst us, not just around the Symposium-DCMÉT, but there was a lot of discussion from last year's symposium which came into this book, and I'm really in it, all these discussions, and I'm really thankful for that. So the theme for today, really, when we wrote that, this blurb saying that we will discuss post-digital pedagogies, the question was, okay, so when we talk about the post-digital, we usually think about the intersections between the environment, between the digital worlds, virtuality, digital communications, things such as now this situation where we speak online, we are at the hotel somewhere in the Croatian coast, somebody is in Chile, somebody is somewhere else. So there was a lot of talk about these relationships between physical and online things. But then with the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, and even before, it has become more and more prominent that we are facing another challenge, and this challenge is really the intersections between biology and information. And I don't mean just things such as bioengineering and genetic engineering and all those various ethical concerns which come out from all those things, but I also mean like there are some philosophical questions such as how does this thing play out, and this is and Sarah knows a lot about it because we also co-edited a book on bioinformational philosophy with Michael Peters. And then there's of course the question of what critical pedagogy can teach us about those things, and which lessons from critical pedagogy can we draw into these considerations, into this conceptual shift when we don't just think about humans and technologies, but we also think about humans, technologies, environment, and biology as one single ecosystem, a la, I would say, perhaps cybernetics of the early and mid 20th century, but really on steroids because we live in a completely different world these days. So this is the rough overview. You see, I mean, you can all Google the book, you can see what contributors to the book said, but what I'm actually really interested is to hear various perspectives. And this is a perfect place for that, because we have people coming from all over the world. We have simultaneous translation to Spanish. I would really like to thank all the translators and of course the organizers who made this translation happen. And perhaps we can start with a simple question or with a simple theme of these bio-digital or bioinformational convergences, how these things came into being and what they are and how they work, and perhaps a bit of a background. Sarah, could you perhaps tell us a few words about that?
Yes, certainly. I just lost you for a second because I'm a bit incompetent tonight with all my windows, so forgive me there. So which did you want me to comment on, Peter? Sorry, say that again.
Well, I was thinking about bioinformation, biodigital convergences, just to set us up, to give us a bit of a philosophical background.
Yes, certainly. So really delighted to be able to talk on this topic, and hope that we'll have lots of contributions in the chat from people as we explore this. As Peter says, we had the two books that we were working on almost simultaneously. I wrote a chapter in one and helped edit the other. So I've just put a link in about these post-digital science and education books. The whole idea of us exploring technology critically and then bringing into that biology has been fascinating for me, and the effects on information, how we might perhaps review the kind of economic setup that we have globally, the neoliberal kind of underpinnings of what we do, and how some of this philosophy might come in to help us to look differently at how we might have a more sustainable society economically through green deals, as we were writing about with Michael Peters, but equally how that changes the discourse then about education and the post-digital eco-pedagogies that the other book was about. So that's a little bit of a start. Peter, would you like me to say more?
Well, perhaps. I mean,
yeah, I can do. I can't stop once I get started. So for myself, I have enjoyed writing critically about educational policy and unpicking a lot of the problems that I think that are in assumptions that we make about technology and education. And so I've talked about this as policy in the past, and I've based this on McDonaldization theory. And what I like about us exploring these bioinformational philosophies is the way in which we can, you're squinting, Peter, are you all right?
Yeah, I'm fine,
yeah,
I'm fine.
okay. Yeah, it's okay. I wasn't sure if you'd stop being able to hear me.
No, I can hear you.
Yeah, so I think this helps us actually look much more holistically at such rapid technological change. And one of the things I'm very interested in is also people's individual diversity and positionalities within that. So I think these kind of things, in the chapter that I wrote, I was exploring attainment and progress in a different eco-pedagogical angle compared to the way that we, rather particularly in the UK, simply look at trying to get people through universities and schools in a very linear model of progress. So these were some of the ideas that I was really enjoying exploring in the chapter that I was writing for the Ecopedagogies book. But these were crossing over very much with the bioinformational philosophy as well, and the ideas of much more global change and sustainability across economy, and underpinning how we then talk about education. I'm pausing for a minute, Peter.
Yeah. I'm just thinking this symposium being held in Chile and with people from all around the world. I mean, what we found really interesting in this, dealing with both with bioinformation and with ecopedagogies, was that actually we could see so many ancient lines of racial, gender, or whatever discrimination. You can follow practically old colonialist lines directly into the world of bioinformation. And I was really surprised because I thought that we were doing something high tech, and then people would come in and people would write about the global south, the global north, and these kind of things. And I think it's wonderful because this place is, I think, quite a unique opportunity to actually discuss relationships between this and things such as colonialism, for instance, or indigenous approaches or stuff like that. So I would perhaps like to ask if anybody from our participants would like to join or perhaps comment on this kind of on these post-digital eco-pedagogical questions from a perspective which is not just perhaps Western-centric or global or something. I mean, I would just like to invite some other perspectives into the conversation. So I'm kind of hoping that somebody will hop in. Sure, Andrea, just unmute yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. It's a joy to be here today. I have a question. I'm wondering, could you provide a little context on what you mean by post-digital?
Well, yeah. I mean, Jeremy, would you like to explain briefly what the post-digital is?
Well, I think we can perhaps all contribute to that a little bit. I guess for me, the key way that I've tried to use it along with Peter and others is drawing from a longer tradition of post-theorizing, postmodernism, post-structuralism, and so on. And in those areas, I understand the post to mean a holding to account, and in other words, a being critical of. So therefore, for me, the post-digital means holding to account the assumptions that we have about the digital. And I think in recent years, assumptions have built up around the promise of what digital technologies are going to provide to society, which haven't quite played out. So for me, the post-digital is about holding to account those promises of a better tomorrow through digitality. I don't know.
Sure, of course. Yeah, everybody. Just to pick up on that a little bit too, would be you can think of the post-digital through the pre-digital as well. So if you're looking at something that bounds educational actors in a particular state, one such thing would be strategy and policy, how that's codified into, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 4, which calls for a massed scaling of educational provision, which governments are increasingly interpreting through a technological lens. So it's a pre-digital policy instrument being interpreted in a clumsy way through a technological means. So you have the ecological issues associated with that on top of that interpretation. You have the acquisition of more and more technology. You have the mining of more and more conflict minerals to satisfy that, the creation of that technology. You have more and more e-waste sites scattered throughout sub-Saharan Africa, things of that nature. So you can see that the post-digital interpretation allows you to catch that strategy and policy issue before it necessarily becomes one. So I think it's important in the post-digital state to see how all those things are lined up and how they all sort of amplify, they have amplifying effects one on top of the other.
Just to jump in a little bit, because I love both of those explanations and entirely, I'm on board with those. I think it's being able to take that lens and look back the way as well, isn't it, on things that are pre-digital and how that might influence how we look ahead as well as in the current, because for far too long in the careers that Peter and I have had, we've been in environments at times where people have simply talked about digital always enhancing what we do. And, being able to take a more critical approach and look relationally back and forth at what has actually been happening, that's meant a great deal to me. And I'm not sure if you have something you want to add to that, Peter.
Well, I'm just reading Andrea's comment and we note, and I think it's a great comment. And I think that, well, post-digital is kind of biodigital as well, in a sense that when we speak about people and computers, like the three of us or 23 of us now talking through our screens, we can also speak about direct tinkering with biological bodies, whether it's human bodies or some other bodies. There's this Catherine Page Harden. She just recently published a book called The Genetic Lottery, where she explains, for instance, lines of inequality in genetic research. And she says that not only that most researchers in genetic in the area of genetics research are white men, but also that subjects are also white men, meaning that the most of actually genetic code that we have collected is the genetic code collected from white men. Now it creates problems on several levels, because if your database is skewed towards a certain type of population, and you use this database to, for instance, create a vaccine that will work for everybody, then this vaccine will work better for somebody and will work worse for somebody else. So when you said about extractivism to create technology from nature, it's not just about literal extractivism of taking oil or gas. It's often the extractivism of taking information which in this case is bioinformation, and bioinformation has quite difficult implications. It's not the same when somebody scans your genes and when somebody scans you through a CCTV camera. It's a different level of scanning. It's a different level of implications. And so on at one level, it's hugely important to talk about honoring and respecting, as you said, indigenous peoples and their sovereignty and so on. But then honoring can often actually be lip service, which covers something else, and it's actually quite you know. So there are these fundamental things when we talk about biodigital equality or biodigital justice, which need to be taken account. Things that we haven't thought about yesterday. We hadn't thought about yesterday because we had no need to think about them.
Yeah, but no, these are all great points, and I just want to pick up on the mining aspect of this. Like Peter is saying, essentially, it's not just the technological, it's not just the mineral extraction, it's the data extraction, the data colonization that takes place, and how that data is being used to generate new technological quote unquote advancements in these spaces that have that ecological disruption about them. And I think, Sarah, you're saying it's a noisy form. It's a very noisy form of technological progress and development. It very much is. But I think at the same time, too, there are models within indigenous spaces that can allow for reinterpretation of that development. So coming from the Andes, for example, Buen Vivir, coming from South Asia, you have Jugad, which is this frugal development. You have these ideas of something being in balance ecologically, so you can develop technology, but you're still having it in balance. It doesn't always work in practice, but it's an interesting model that would sit askew from largely the Western model of unfettered growth, unfettered kind of technological development.
I think you mentioning data triggered me off there, because who gets to participate in data creation is a really interesting area. I mean, looking at it more globally as well, and linked to that, perhaps also the different things that we've written about who gets to publish and the dominance of certain types of journals, which Peter and Michael have written so much about. But I was just thinking about the human data interaction book that we have on in progress at the moment, and hopefully will be complete and going in for publication at the end of the year. And people are writing from different angles in the community as to how data is actually affected, you know, their areas, or who gets to actually, you know, get involved in creating data, or even understanding what's collected on them. So I think there's many other branching questions from what you were saying.
Well, excellent. I mean, I would really like I hate the word audience. I would like to say participants, our friends and our comrades and people who joined us today to bring forward their own questions, their own dilemmas, their own ideas. I mean, we've published a lot about it. We continue to write, we continue to explore things, but places like this are amazing because we can actually share things and learn from people that we may not meet otherwise. So are there perhaps any other comments in this direction that somebody would like to make? Can you tell us the story, Jeff? I don't know about Henrietta Lex. What's do you guys know? Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm no expert about her, but she's an African-American woman who her cells were taken without her permission, and then they were used for medical research. And it was amazing what they've been able to do in terms of using, I think they call it HeLa cells now, that have been cloned over and over. And the World Health Organization, others have been talking about just what incredible medical breakthroughs these have made for science but which is wonderful. But at the same time, this was done without her permission, and then she never benefited in any way where other people copyrighted and profited from this.
Mm.
Yeah, there are. I mean, I've editing those things. I never heard this particular story, or maybe I just forgot about the name. But thinking about, I mean, there are stories of, and the thing is that it's really fundamentally different when you take somebody's photo in the street, and when you use this photo for an ad, for instance, so you to promote whatever, Coca-Cola, and you took something from somebody and use it to gain some profit, right? But it's not really the same when you take a snapshot, a photo of somebody, and when you deal with their, I mean, bodily material, genetic material, or whatever. And the huge difference here is the okay, now I'm just gonna go a bit deeper. Sorry for this confused thing. Biology, for centuries, biology was a science of description. So you had Carl Linnaeus, for instance, who classified the living world. You had all those things, but generally biology was the science of description. There was some, you know, people would grow certain crops in certain ways, like corn, or we bred certain species of dogs, so certain types of dogs for certain things, and so on. But basically, all those things were very took a very long time. So you couldn't just do it like really quickly, like really easily. But now with the marriage between digital technology and biology, or what we have now, we have bioinformation. We can basically take this code, digitize it, tinker with it within the computer, change the code a bit, and then return it back to the living world, meaning that we basically can change. It's not just about taking a snapshot. It's not like the example of taking a photo of the person in the street, but we can actually tinker with things which are within, which kind of potentially creates a lot of good, as the example that you just described, but it also potentially, I mean, can create a lot of trouble, and it opens a whole array of questions of who should be able to collect this data, what kind of permissions, what kind of storage, what kind of security, and so on. We should actually do what we should actually do with it. And there's the question of post-humanism, really, which is kind of very connected. Yeah. Post-humanism.
Be lovely to hear from others, wouldn't it? That I can see a lot of participants. It would be nice to hear a few further thoughts.
Well, while we are waiting for somebody, Sarah, our podcast is actually online now. So if you click on this link, we had a lovely conversation between Michael Peters, Derek Ford, Sarah, myself, Alex Means, and Amy Soyot about biodigitalism and ecopedagogical futures. And it's a podcast which we recorded a few months ago, but it actually just became available a few hours ago. I just received an email that it's fresh out of the press. So this is the title and this is the podcast. So if anybody is interested, I mean, if this discussion sparks your interest, then there's definitely more to be heard under this link. This is just a bit of advertisement for later. And perhaps I'm really interested in post-humanist aspects of this as well, which are we did have a conversation about it earlier today, Michael, Jeremy, and I. So perhaps somebody could say something about it.
Well, maybe just to respond to what you were, the conversation you were just having a moment ago, Peter, is, you know, the logical next step, I think, then to be talk about ethics. And, you know, this is something we've seen recently to a great degree with artificial intelligence, given the assumptions of a great threat to society from data-driven technologies. We've seen a wealth of ethical principles, frameworks, and codes being generated from all sorts of governments, supranational organizations, and so on. And, you know, the biodigital seems to me to be an area where our ethical thinking, in a similar way, lags behind what we can do with technology. And certainly for me, and this is, although I haven't necessarily written very much about the bioinformational, but in terms of artificial intelligence, something I've been writing about recently is a critique of sort of protocolization of ethics that we've seen through principles and frameworks and guidelines. This idea that drawing on a very narrow and thin idea of ethics, deontology, if anybody's familiar with that, which is the idea that we can simply write a set of rules, and if those rules are followed, then no unethical situations will arise. So I think that's, you know, that's the danger when we start to see examples like the one that Jeff highlighted. I think where we see technologies that seem to be doing things that are far beyond our current ethical thinking is for us to rush towards defining high-level principles. And I think we need a much more robust, a much more community-driven, a much more participative way of generating a sort of ethics in practice for these kinds of.
I love the comment that's just been made as well in relation to what you're saying, Jeremy, from Alex there. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see that. One of the things that I think is quite nice to contemplate about holding the post-digital accountable is in the context of the new work that you're doing, Peter, on post-digital research, because I've been mulling this over today, given we've got a session tomorrow about this, and thinking there are the challenges of it falling back into a very traditional research model if we're not careful. So one way to hold it accountable is to, how do we actually keep it as open and participatory and inclusive as it is at the moment, as a concept that you wrestle with, and that you maybe bring really interesting new methodologies to, rather than closing it down and just siphoning the post-digital research idea along with the rest, was one of my thoughts today, and I'll probably go on about it tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is spot on. I would just like to add, actually, there's loads of problems with the concept of the post-digital, Alex. It's not, the more I'm trying to grapple with the concept, the more blind spots and problems I see. One of the biggest problems, as Sarah said, is how do we as a community balance the fact that we put everything we like in the concept. So like pretty much this more or less very, very open approach to the concept, and then still keep it meaningful without being a word for everything, you know, like the answer 42 in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I mean, the question is, how do you keep the concept compact and useful and yet open at the same time? This is I think a huge tension that we are dealing with. But then also, I think that the concept of the post-digital, and with all these things such as the biodigital and so on, has huge implications. For instance, one of the blind spots that we had in the book And now I will look at Jeff, although he doesn't see me, because I mean, Jeff, of course, is somebody who's written really, really, well, for me at least, the key readings about in and about digital literacy, right? So what are the, for instance, biodigital implications in terms, I mean, because there is our friend and colleague, Ben Williamson, he writes about the use of neural technology in education, brain plasticity, brain sculpturing, kids in school having some devices, trying to foster teaching and learning through really neural technology. And of course, Ben opens up many important ethical and intellectual questions like we opened up today. But what should be the educational response to these questions? I mean, how do we develop biodigital literacy, for instance? I mean, which direction should we even look at?
Perhaps in a similar way, and I should say, Alex, I think I owe you an email, so I think I've been meaning to get back to you. I will try to do that. Great question. I think maybe in a similar way to Peter, my worries about the post-digital are its longevity, and it has always seemed to me to be valuable as a way of speaking about a transition. I'm sort of reminded of the way Neil Badminton talked about post-humanism as a necessary shorthand for talking about something that he couldn't quite touch upon yet. I'm paraphrasing him there. But what is it that we're getting to through talking about it? And in doing that, the term itself might become redundant. So I suppose that would be my concern with it, and then how much one invests in that term as an all-encompassing way of describing what we're talking about.
Yeah, but I can jump in as well. Just picking up on that, without commenting specifically on that, is that the idea of, like, I think it's useful as a term to avoid the discursive closure that takes place with a lot of this type of thing. This is I'm quoting Annette Markham from her article in 2021. It's the idea of discursive closure, that the seeming inevitability of all of these things will shut down possible futures, the idea of possible futures. And I think the post-digital and the post-humanism, I think by decentering the human in that equation, allows for the rehabilitation of lost futures. I think these ideas that might have been valid in other contexts that were shut down discursively can be rehabilitated. So I think there's something to be said for discursive closure as well. So the discourses around the technology do the work of the technology itself. They shut down the possibility of anything else. So I think the post-digital provides a mechanism to interrogate that a little bit and to sort of rehabilitate or even resurrect a little bit of these lost futures.
I would entirely agree with you there. And I also wonder constantly about how we actually get some of these conversations back into the ways in which we might write policies differently, because we all just accept that that is something that just looks like it looks like, but how you actually blow that wide open and change the way that we do those kinds of documents, and why they're even documents always fascinates me too, because it allows us to contain those ideas, as you say, and to keep things closed and not open those discourses.
Future studies are these days very, I mean, they're a hot topic again. And I reading, I mean, I'm not old enough, thankfully, to remember like very old history, but I've never seen so many articles about educational futures, about futures in general. Some things happened that people suddenly started writing, discussing futures, educational futures, much more than they used to in the past. I think there was something about the COVID that triggered this focus to futures thinking.
I think so too, and I think who was writing the future before this, I think, is an important question as well. The commercial entities were largely writing the educational futures through the way they were presenting the technology, how they constructed the role of the teacher within that technology, or not in many cases, simply removing the teacher from the equation, from the educational equation. So I think it was an awareness, there was an increased awareness of the fact that the commercial imaginaries of technology, for example, are writing that future. They are creating those discursive contexts that we operate. And I think a lot of these ideas of educational futures is an attempt by the profession to take back that ability to craft a future. So I see it as a positive step, but it's just a step.
I think it's really interesting raising the idea of all of this coming through the COVID pandemic. Something I was thinking about again today, and even the examples of the testimonies you collected, Peter, and the work done year upon year on that, which, for the benefit of those who might not know, was about 80, was it, people globally who talked about their positioning in the pandemic over the period of the pandemic, 1 year after another. Peter invited them to write a 500-word account of how they were experiencing suddenly being expected to teach from home online in tiny spaces or bigger spaces with family involved and everything else that was going on in life. And because of such a prolonged period across the globe experienced differently, I think it surfaced so much. And again, I wonder if participants have any thoughts on that, because this is so much a part of this conversation, isn't it? The recent pandemic experiences.
Well, we do have two comments. The first one chronologically came from Jeff, saying that when I think about ecopedagogies, I worry about how digital and much of our information technology separates us from the environment, creating new dangers for our sustainability on this planet. It doesn't have to be, but this is where educators need to address these disconnections with our students. Well, I would say that digital technology, like these clanky things that I'm using to talk to you at the moment, indeed disconnects us from the environment. But biotech actually connects us to the environment and in a very serious way. Like, for instance, biochemical weapons. Like, just by the fact that you live in a city which has been infected by something means that you're infected as well. The idea of mass vaccination, actually, this is where, when we use information technology to tinker with biology, basically it's, on the one hand, it is indeed a form of separation, Jeff, and I completely agree, because it does put us in the position which Steve Fuller would call God's shoes. But then on the other hand, it directly connects us, because biotech is actually, here, when you cannot disconnect this technology from your body, and when you cannot disconnect it from your body, then you cannot disconnect it from a brain as well. So it is this dynamic between inclusion and exclusion, which I find really fascinating.
And maybe just to respond to that point as well, Jeff. For me, I'd always like to go back, not just about the technology, but to talk about pedagogy in relation to eco-pedagogy, because pedagogy, by which we mean education, has been, as writers like Richard Edwards and Robin Usher, who come to mind, have convincingly written, has been tied to a very humanist idea that through education separates us from the environment. Before we get to talking about the technology, a Eurocentric humanism, which not only positions humans as transcendent from the environment, but positions the environment as a resource that we can use to maintain that transcendence. Of course, that's not entirely separate from the technology, but the core point is that that foundational humanism that arguably is in our existing ideas of education and pedagogy is the very thing that structures how we then think about and use technology. So for me, thinking again about post-humanism, I always feel inclined to go back to and critique some of the humanist assumptions that ground our education and that really foundationally structure in a separation between us and our environment. And for me, technologies are often really just building on that fundamental assumption of separation. If you want.
No, that's good.
Seems to be many more comments there, Peter.
Oh yeah, there are quite, but I can see that Sarah is responding to these comments.
Sorry, yes, and listening at the same
I
time.
was kind of hoping that Sarah would, yeah, because I haven't even managed to read them. So
There's lots of wonderful ideas coming through there, actually. And what Andrea was talking about was the comment that Roy made early on in the pandemic about it being a portal that could carry us from one world to the next, one that would be more radically socially, environmentally just. And I was struck by it at the time, struggling to write a book myself on what was going on, as well as to keep up with Peter and his testimonies. And I just thought this idea of, what it really meant, we shouldn't lose, the debates and the dialogue around it need to go on. It feels in our universities as if there's very much a, well, that was then and this is now. And, I don't think we can afford to do that in education and suddenly, close it off and back to normal, which is, there's quite a drive in the UK for that kind of thing at the moment.
yeah, well, I mean, that this is something I wrote a few times in through different versions. Shame on me, because I think it's a really important thought. Like, I mean, those relationships between biology and information and society, they are not really today's news. I mean, Dyson speaks about that practically with cloning of Dolly the sheep somewhere, I think 1996 at Edinburgh or something like that. Budgets for biology research have surpassed budgets for physics research, like atomic research and stuff like that, CERN and Large Hadron Collider and so on. And then he gave a bombastic statement that the 20th century was the century of physics and that the 21st century would be the century of biology. So obviously it's not so straightforward, but these things have been in the making for a long time. And we've had, so since for at least for now more than 20 years, actually those things have been up our faces. But we were still fascinated by the gadgetry and by the fact that phones are getting smaller and smaller and that we can get 25 different social networks to connect with whomever, that we actually just ignored this largely until the pandemic. And when the pandemic broke out, it's not that that's something new, very new surfaced. All those things have been present, like puzzle. But at some point, they just joined together, and people have suddenly started to talk much more about all those things. And interestingly, some other things have been, some other discussions have been shut down. So just a few years before the pandemic, you would hear many people worrying about their privacy online, for instance, security and so on. But as soon as things got locked down, everybody pretty much forgot about their privacy and they just logged into Zoom or whatever. And they suddenly stopped to care about some things. and started to care about other things. So there's also a bit of fashion in academic research, and I'm not ashamed to say that that I follow fashion, right? So I myself didn't see. I mean, I had all the ingredients, but I didn't see those biodigital and ecopedagogical questions before the pandemic, and I didn't see them even then. But when we did all these collections that Sarah is mentioning, with all those testimonies by all those people, when we discussed with many people, and when you distill all those things, actually, okay, so now is the time to talk about ecopedagogies, now is the time to talk about bioinformational philosophy, and so on. But those things have a long historical tail. They're not new. They're just not new to me, perhaps, because I suddenly decided to switch my attention to them because of my environment. And I think that a lot of that happened to many other people. That this is why we now have this upsurge in this area. I mean that there's more and more research in this area than it used to be before. So we learned a lot from the pandemic.
I think it certainly grew the community of people who are exploring post-digital ideas, biodigital ideas, didn't it? And I think gave a little bit of space for that to diversify as well. All the time, maybe thinking about some of the problems as we were challenged earlier to think about by Alex of, exploring some of the issues around post-digital as a concept. I just made the comment about what we can or can't believe, because I think that becomes an increasing problem too. And I know colleagues here have written about those kinds of issues with the social media, but also with what can actually be achieved to deceive through technology now. So I threw that in for good measure.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've learned is that it's really, really important. And I mean, this session is a bit strange, right? We have those long breaks when nobody's talking, and then like it looks like, and then we are like expecting somebody to say something. I mean, not really. Of course, that Sarah and I edited 2 books about it, and of course that we could speak about the theme for 5 hours. But the idea, and of course that the rest of the panel here are people who have written about it, who have been thinking about it very deeply, and probably most participants in this session would easily be able to deliver a 1-hour lecture on the theme just out of the blue if somebody wakes them up in the middle of the night, because we have been thinking about those things. But then what's interesting, I think, and what's important, I think, is to reconvene and to just see how other people, not just what people think about it, but also how people feel about those things. And also when you talk to people like this, when I see Andrea talking, when I see Jeff, whoever is now has the camera on and so on, basically what we have here is, and I mean, I think it's this effective aspects of research and in general knowledge making is a hugely important one, which is neglected and which works really well in the digital world, because when you're dealing with zeros and ones, when you're dealing with numbers, then it's fine. But when we are dealing with bios, with biological entities, then I think that we should take into account all those things as well. And I think for me, this is one of the main. I mean, this is why I fell in love with this symposium, and this is why I come back. Since I was invited first time, I come back over and over and over again, because it allows this kind of open discussion and this kind of brainstorming. And it can be awkward, it can be weird, it can be very pleasurable, it can be sometimes not pleasurable at all, but I think it's valuable. I think it's valuable to allow all these forms of discussion and all these forms of reconvening and really being together and learning together. And developing whatever our understanding.
I think linked to that, Peter, is also these projects that you've been so involved in where people have done collective writing. And so you mentioned earlier about the podcast about that process, but these articles where people are intervening in each other's written text as well are really fascinating and to me a very important part of this too. So this dialogue is so enjoyable, and then also having that dialogue is slightly different when you're doing it in text, written text, but then it's also out there in a form for people to access too, isn't it? And I didn't know if you had any further thoughts on that, because you've been involved in so many of these collective writing projects.
Well, the thing is that there is this, I mean, ancient or traditional or whatever classical model of scholar, somebody who learns, reads, writes, or perhaps goes around and drinks like Bukowski, and then sits alone at home with a computer or with a pen and pencil and writes something and produces a masterpiece, and then goes out and then presents this masterpiece. But in reality, things are not like that. And most of us who are not geniuses like Bukowski are people who actually can do something only together with others. Now, the point is that there are many different others. And here, just reading names on this screen, I mean, you can see from how many different backgrounds people are coming. And so how do I work with this other? And now, of course, there's some strategies work better in writing, some other strategies work better in a discussion, face-to-face, online discussion, whatever. What I find fascinating is that, for instance, I made this. I mean, I'm totally guilty of a mistake. Remember, Sarah, when I started presenting those collective articles? So the first few presentations, it was a collective article of 80 people. 80 people wrote the article, and somebody invited me to present the article. So I come over, here's the audience, I take a deep breath, take the whole screen, cover everybody else, do, and to talk for half an hour without a break. I mean, this is where my mode of presentation didn't really fit with the mode of knowledge making presented within the paper. Yeah. And now, if we have a paper where everybody is free to write 500 words, it doesn't mean that you need to write 500 words. You can write 50 words, or you can write 1,000, or you cannot write at all. Similarly, like in this session, somebody has remained quiet, somebody has typed, somebody has said something loud, somebody has switched on the camera, somebody has switched off the camera. So there are various modes of collaborating. Now, what's interesting is that I think that this, when we talk about this post-digital collaboration, we usually think of this humans versus machines, as if humans are something which is pretty much unchangeable, and as if machines are something that is just a tool. And there are many problems with that. And that's why I'm kind of trying, I mean, I've got so much to say against transhumanism, but I can feel its appeal. And I feel that back to post-digital ecopedagogies, I think that we should look into not only post-humanism, but that we should look into transhumanism again. Not, of course, as the one and the only truth, because there's so many problems with transhumanism. But I think that we should go back and reconsider some of these old transhumanist assumptions and arguments, because I think they are and will be increasingly relevant in our post-digital or bio-digital reality, especially when related to ecopedagogies.
Well, there's been some wonderful insight shared from the presenters, from also the audience members and attendees. It's been a compelling conversation, and I hope to come back to this and revisit it because there's a lot to think about and a lot to chew on. So thank you to all of you. Petar, thank you for chairing this session and bringing these conversations together. It's wonderful to see all of you. I hope we can keep the conversations going. As I mentioned, there is a happy hour that's later today. I'll put the link in the chat just now. There are also wonderful sessions throughout the week. There's a session in half an hour that will be talking about the nonprofit sector in Canada and citizenship in relation to engagement. So just wanted to say thank you again to all of you. Really appreciate your time, your energy, and enthusiasm on these topics. And I do hope to see your faces soon in other sessions. And thank you to everyone who contributed.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody. I'm just trying to type in the most unnatural position in the world. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Wonderful, wonderful to be with you.
Yeah. Good to see everyone.
And of course, Miranda, you, Paul, Gina, and everybody else. I mean, my warmest regards and thanks for organizing this, really. Michael, you know, and all the rest. I will surely forget somebody, so, so I should better stop.
Thank you for the warm sentiments. They're certainly sent back to you, and have a wonderful evening and best wishes with both conferences.
All the best. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Cheers,
for coming.
Take care, everyone.